Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Tsegaye and my guest today is Tsegaye Ararssa. Tsegaye Ararssa, as most of you will know, I'm sure, is a commentator on Ethiopian politics, a public intellectual, a writer, a thinker, and constitutional lawyer, an activist, and a polymath, I think is fair to say. And today he joined me to help us make sense of the mess that is Ethiopia. And thank you, Tsegaye, for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Tsegaye, for a very warm introduction, which humbles me. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
A pleasure. Going to have a lot to get through in the course of the next 1 hour or so, Tsegaye. But I think I will have to start with a question that might border on the personal, and I want to ask you how you have managed to cope the past 3 years, but also the past decade. Really, have really been immersed in Ethiopian politics, and you're someone who is really interested in ideas, in discourse, in intellectual debate. And of course, as you know, and I know, that is absent in Ethiopian discourse generally. People prefer to engage in personal attacks, in ad hominem attacks generally, I mean, everything but ideas. And my experience in the past 2 years, I haven't really been engaged in political affairs in Ethiopia in the way that you do, kind of at an intellectual level. I was more like an activist, but even that was very taxing and energy sapping, and it took its toll on me. And I have always wondered how people like you, who are engaged in politics at a completely different level, have managed to not just carry on, but also thrive in the political discussion. So please say a few words about that, how we have managed to get going.
Well, the one thing that keeps us going is the fact that there is an unfinished business in the political dynamics of Ethiopia, that there is yet no resolution to most of the public issues that exercise our minds. And so, however tiresome it is, however tasking it is, however painful sometimes it is, you keep going, you keep forging ahead, because your people are enduring an even worse problem. And while your people are living under circumstances that are really not livable, you can't complain about what people say about you, do up to you, in terms of really persecution in my case. Not just me, but also the university I was in, and also affecting my personal status as a foreigner in this country, affecting my asylum case, and so on and so forth. The one thing that keeps us moving, therefore, is that we are making a difference to the lives of our people at home, and the fact that things are not resolved makes you want to do more, irrespective of the noise around you. But for me, it's also because what I do in the realm of commentating and writing and speaking on Ethiopian political, constitutional, legal issues is generally my bread and butter. It's something that I have been doing for a long time, something that I am doing until today. Since around 20 years ago, since year 2000, I started to study Ethiopian constitutional law as a public, at a master's level. I started to study the constitutional issues that exercise the public's mind since that time on, and that have been, the issues of constitutional law, self-determination, multinationalism, and so on and so forth, federalism, is a subject that I've been dealing with in class with my students at the graduate and undergraduate level. It is a subject that I do research and write about, including up to my PhD level. And so, because it is something that I live with, it comes very much naturally for me to go out and speak about it whenever there are some issues in these areas. And also because even way before all these processes started, when I was in Ethiopia, I was teaching on these subjects to many of the people who are participants in the public life, the parliamentarians, the soldiers in the Ministry of Defense, the senior generals who, the leadership, the police academy, in these places. So I'm very much engaged with the participants of the public life. And I'm used to confront them with these thoughts and ideas. And now that the country's constitutional dynamics set up is shaken up because of first the protest movements, then the change, the reform, then the war, and so on and so forth. All those issues I used to work on, I used to think through or debate on, come back and come alive. And so I basically draw from that experience of living with these kinds of issues to talk about it endlessly. However, the engagement from our adversaries sometimes is a little painful. It's savage, really. And it makes you, it destabilizes your intellectual standing. Sometimes it affects your sanity, to be honest. The name calling, the defamation, the cyber attack, not just on you, the threats, not just on you, but your family members, the universities, and so on and so forth. That really takes quite a toll on your life, on your mental health. It's quite a pressure on your personality also, because it makes you bitter, angry, sometimes unmerciful in your use of words, which you might have seen in me at different times. And it makes you go off balance. However, that you would take only as a personal challenge. So because there is an unfinished business out there in the world of real life politics, real life in Ethiopia, and the fact that there are issues unresolved, people's rights that are still openly violated, thousands of prisoners political prisoners in prison, assassinations, attacks, gross atrocities, mass atrocity crimes in the region. And now you see this genocidal madness. And then so many humanitarian crises that unfold over time, and you will have to extend a helping hand to at least some of the people who are suffering. When you consider the work that awaits you out there, whatever persecution you face here, whatever ad hominem attacks that you face here would be only a personal challenge, something that you have to overcome or kind of shut aside and just forge ahead. But of course it does take it precisely because of that, precisely because you shoulder the public attack personally. It really, really takes a toll, and you kind of ignore your own life and you focus on the public issues that you pursue, the social activism, political activism that you are in. And when you turn back to your own personal life, you see that you are a rake, and it takes a while for you to take a step back and take a breath and get back to it again. Another reason I think I kind of survive is because, you see, for someone who has a stake in the political process, who's someone who wanted to have a political power after all this is done, if I were someone who would like to appeal to some kind of constituency for support, or if I was trying to please some people somewhere so that I can climb up in the political ladder, then it could have caused a burnout. it could have really made me shrink or change my loyalties or be very careful about my criticism and so on and so forth. But from the start, I took it upon myself to do what I call is a modest work of public intellectual work. And when I do that, I enjoy to be an irritant, especially because I'm a critical legal scholar as well. I want to irritate as many people as possible so that I can destabilize their epistemic position, so that I can defamiliarize the familiar and familiarize the unfamiliar. And that's, I think, the calling of a critical scholar. So I was more like acting as an academic godfly, which I'm used to because I've been teaching constitutional law for 15 years. And when I do bring this into activism now, I'm not afraid of using sharp words and engaging combatively, and partly because I'm a lawyer who teaches trial advocacy and so on and so forth. And in fact, this criticism makes me tick and makes me want to do more and to always engage more forcefully, more combatively, and get sustenance out of it, out of that process itself. And if you are someone who see your calling as one of speaking truth to power, as an intellectual gadfly, challenging everybody, irritating everybody, not caring about pleasing any particular constituency, then all those attacks don't mean much because there is nothing you would lose because of those attacks. But if I were investing in political, future political position, then all those defamatory activities, all those name callings, all those putting words into your mouth and misinterpret what you say, all those things would affect you and will batter you so much. But for me, it doesn't matter. It's like going to classrooms and shocking the intellectual positions of my students and then coming back and see if they have learned anything. So that's how I survived, I think.
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm flattering you, Tsegaye, but I think you are playing the quintessential role of the public intellectual, or the intellectual gadfly, as you put it, and that is to your eternal credit, really. And you mentioned part of the drive and part of the motivation comes from the knowledge that there is some unfinished business, and we'll come back to talk about what that unfinished business is. But also, you mentioned some of your adversary, and I think it's fair to say that one of your current adversaries would be the Ethiopian regime, in the light of the positions that you have taken, not less vis-a-vis the war, but also in terms of the direction into which it's taken the country, and people who have known you only for the past 3 years might be tempted into thinking that actually you were on the side of the EPRDF, for instance, or of the TPLF, because what has happened the past 3 years is generally, by and large, people who were against the TPLF have supported the war and have sided with Abiy, and then the other side on the other end of the spectrum. But actually, you were against the EPRDF. You had gone through a lot of trouble because of the EPRDF, and I know even personally. And I wanted to ask you, why and how was it possible for you to sort of transcend those sorts of ethnic or local allegiances and to be driven by principles and by values? Instead, as far as I understand, you went to Ethiopian school, you went to the same schools that we went to in terms of the value that they impart. But there is something that is striking about you, Tsegaye, which is that you are seamlessly able to transcend those things that seem to grip most people in Ethiopia and just be guided and dictated by principles. So I know I'm putting you in a difficult spot, but I want you to speak about that a bit.
Well, you are enormously kind to me, and I feel flattered, to be honest. I didn't have to transcend anything. I just look, I studied Ethiopian constitutional law, and I made it a commitment, I think, somewhere around 2011. I had written a small piece, Pledges of a Legal Academic in Ethiopia. The title was Pledges of a Legal Academic in Ethiopia. I had written it on a scrap note, a notebook, randomly with my hand, and a friend saw it and said, I need to publish this, or you need to publish this. And I said, you think it's worth the point, the while? I said, yeah. And then we polished it, and I sent it, and it was published in Mizan Law Review in the reflection section. So it's a one-page pledge. I have been exercised with Ethiopian constitutional interpretive scheme for years, and the constitution would mean what the interpreter says it is. And it was a chaotic constitutional interpretation system in Ethiopia. So I was always angry about the hermeneutical anarchy, as I saw it then, in the area of constitutional law. First and foremost, the interpretive institution is said to be the House of Federation. And most people think that because the House of Federation has the ultimate say in interpretation, the courts do not have any role in the interpretive scheme. And then there is this strange institution called the Constitutional Inquiry Council. And its role is to make a technical legal analysis of any particular constitutional case and then submit its proposal to the House of Federation, which finally votes on that proposal. And around all these areas, there wasn't any clarity. And the Ethiopian ordinary courts, they hesitated, shied away from engaging with the constitution because they thought this is not our realm, it is the House of Federation, and so on. And the House of Federation obviously is a political institution and didn't have much understanding of what is at stake there. And the Constitutional Inquiry Council wasn't very well organized. And around this confusion, the constitution wasn't really turned into a legally consumable product for many years. And one of the articles I wrote used to be making legal sense of human rights in Ethiopia. The reason is the human rights provisions that are listed in the constitution, about 31 articles, very generous recognition of all sorts of rights that are known in the International Bill of Rights are there, but they have never been turned into a legally consumable commodity. And I was trying to make sense of that. And why I was so exercised with these things was because there was a complete confusion about who interprets the constitution and how interpretation is done. And in Ethiopia, we don't have the rules of statutory interpretation. Like we have parliamentary acts which guide rules of legal interpretation, and we don't have any. So interpretation became something that anyone can do based on his own conjectures and whims. And that really, and sometimes depending on where we were educated, if you are educated in the United States, you take the Supreme Court model as the universally acceptable model, and you want to read the Ethiopian constitution in the light of the American jurisprudence. If you have gone to Europe and different parts of Europe, sometimes you, and most of my contemporaries went to South Africa where there was a constitutional court. So the constitutional court's jurisprudence and model of interpretation becomes to them the most important model and the universal model of interpretation. And then those of them who go to Europe, depending on whether it is France or Germany or Italy, they will use that model to inject those principles and methods into the reading of the Constitution. And so the meaning of the Constitution, the meaning of laws in general, has become something of an individual conjecture. And I remember saying in Amharic, "Hig ትርጉሙ እንደ ህልም እንደፈቺው ነው በእኛ ሀገር." And I was very angry about these things. And against this and the whims and conjectures, do not make decisions only arbitrary. It's not just because it is arbitrary. It's because politics is infused into it. Your own politics is ultimately what determines the interpretation. And that means you're not really professional about how you approach the law. And at some point within the legal intelligentsia, the understanding that law is a public reason by which we govern society went down the drain. And so they don't approach law as a public text with some degree of veneration, which professionals do. That's why professionals wear a professional robe or a wig even in some places, and they go to specific kind of school and training and exams, bar exams, etc. And when they approach the text, they approach it with some specific kinds of rituals, just like a priest approaches sacred texts with some kind of rituals. And they have got their own method, principles, institutional processes, and so on and so forth. And I was really impatient with Ethiopia's legal profession with regard to its approach to legal texts. And drawing also from the era of the Derg, where, because it's the socialist system, law is an instrument of the ruling powers and so on, the ruling class, etc. There is this subordination of law into politics and your politics. So there is that amount of distanciation that a professional interpretation would require, which I was not seeing. As a result of that, I was always angry about this kind of interpretation, that kind of interpretation. I rail against this one. I rail against the mainstream establishment, the political class. Then I rail against the professional class, horizontally. And I was constantly embattled by different kinds of. And so at some point I said, what should a legal academic pledge to? And I wrote those pledges out of personal reflection. And interestingly, I was reading a book on literature. It's a Northern's Anthology of Literature. I was reading some fragments and some ideas dropped. And then I wrote that on a note, first on the back of the cover of the book, then later on a paper. And then that was published. And that pledges of a legal academic says, it is my responsibility as a legal academic to speak truth to power, to be the prophet of a secular society, and to start to nudge society into imagining a new heaven and a new earth, a new world, a different world, and a better world. That's my responsibility. And I also used to say, I rail against the hermeneutical anarchy. I have to stand against the scholarship of power and politics of empire, and so on and so forth. So those are the statements in there. And it keeps nagging me. I remember I said this, right? And it actually came out of my own heart. It's not something, it wasn't intellectual. It was so much driven by passion when I wrote it, and it still remains with me. And so that passion made me take up responsibility of a whole generation, in fact. And in my writings on legal education in Ethiopia, I kept saying this. I still ask about the Ethiopian legal professions profile. What was its contribution to the public life of that country, except the land to the tiller proclamation in 1974-75? And to a large extent, the Ethiopian legal professions profile is apology for power, including in the recent process of interpreting the constitution to postpone the election of 2020. If you remember, the entire profession conspired to give apology to be apologetic of power and justify sidelining of democracy, really, and outlawing election. That was very infuriating to me. So because I was always in this track, it wasn't easy, it wasn't difficult for me to call out injustice when I see it anywhere, you know. With regard to EPRDF, yes, I have a rough encounter with them. In fact, I'm, you know, I was born during the first revolution. I was just contemporaneously with the 1974 revolution, and I came of age with the second revolution. I was 17 when the EPR, 16, 17, when the EPRDF came into power. And so I was basically my public life, my adult life started with the adoption of the Constitution. The day the Constitution was adopted, I graduated from law school, and I became a teacher in 3 months' time after that. When I teach, and I started teaching at the Ethiopian Civil Service College, where, interestingly, most of the leaders of the struggle, the liberation struggle, were trying to make up for their lost days in the struggle and trying to get some lessons that is commensurate to their positions in the public life they were in. So here I am, a newly minted graduate of law, almost contemporaneously born with the constitutional process, who is very much alert to everything, and going into a classroom of the makers of the Constitution, and then confronting them with all sorts of literature, and then they pushing back against that and trying to discipline me, calm down, and so on. And then, you know, in the process over the years, they consider that I am an irritant, a critical thing, and criticism isn't well taken by the politicians. They thought I am only the intellectual voice, the ideological voice of the opposition. And so, depending on whatever criteria they look at, they would make me an affiliate of this party or that party. Look at my names, Tsegaye Ararssa, and then I become OLF sympathizer. And some of my statements, sounds like the mainstream opposition's criticism of the Constitution. So it must be with Burtukan Mideksa in the group and so on and so forth. So I've been several times pushed around, and some pressures on the part of the government. And then that was something that you live with. It could have dampened some of my critical teaching exercises at the university. It didn't. As I said, when there is criticism, it ticks me, actually. I read more, I study more, I engage more, and with sincerity. To be honest, I learn in the process, and it helps me to consolidate my arguments, sometimes learn from it, and reformulate my arguments and so on. So that was okay, as long as I wasn't sent to jail. And I came very close to that several times, but I didn't. Thankfully, I survived. And then I started this antagonism and confrontation coming out in public only when the Oromo protest movement started. The master plan was being implemented, and the young Oromo folks, Kero and Kare, were basically demanding the implementation of the Constitution. So the Oromo protest movement generally was more focused on the delivery of the promises of the Constitution. And in my view, the constitutional promises were undelivered. And I have always been talking about the redemptive constitutional process to make sure that the Constitution's promises are delivered and made real for the nations of Ethiopia. And then there comes this young generation who were using the master plan as an entry point, resistance to the master plan as an entry point, but to seek some more substantive rights of constitutional rights to be implemented in concrete, practical terms. And I weighed in there. And first, and again, I never considered myself as an activist. I never considered myself as someone who will speak for a political group or, partisan politics and so on. But I wrote an article which says, why resist the master plan? And in an overnight, I became an activist of the Oromo protest movement. And of course, then we ended up coordinating the protest movement along with other friends such as Jawar and so on and so forth. So in that process, I directly came into confrontation with the EPRDF, and they considered us terrorists and they classified us as such. And then, of course, the protest prevailed. Reform was mandatory, and EPRDF tried to reform itself, to look at itself. And in the process of the reform, the tussle for power grab started, and then it ended up in the grabbing of power by Abiy Ahmed and his group. So in spite of that confrontation, though, because I knew from the very start that the protest movement was a movement for social justice, that it was a movement for recognition of the dignity of the nations, especially in the context of the Oromo, the recognition of the identity, linguistic justice, and so on and so forth. So it was a protest for social justice in the sense that it is they were looking for recognition. And secondly, it was about redistribution, as Nancy Fraser says. You know, social justice is nothing but the 3 R's: recognition of identity and dignity, a redistribution of economic resources, social opportunities, and political power. Okay, and representation, and having voice. Those 3 things are what constitutes social justice. And from my point of view, the Oromo protest movement was basically about these 3 R's. Recognize our identity, recognize our linguistic parity in the Ethiopia's federal structure, implement the federal system, and let's have a fair share in the benefits that come from the economic dividends over the years. Let's not make land redistribution skewed against us, you know, not in our favor, and so on and so forth. That's basically what it was. And given the fact that I saw the protest as a demand for more constitutional implementation, I thought that was something that can be easily addressed within the constitutional framework. And in fact, my criticism of the regime at the time, I said, was an act of loyalty. And to date, my criticism against Ethiopia is the ultimate act of loyalty, I believe. It's a redemptive criticism. And then when the protest movement was hijacked by Abiy Ahmed, and when the Abiy Ahmed and his group took one strand of the elements in the protest movement, which is the call for representation and voice and power and agency and so on, they took that and they said the Oromo now deserves to have power. And so they moved into the tactical game of ejecting the TPLF by Oromara Alliance and taking over power and telling the Oromo public that what you have been struggling for, which is taking power in Ethiopia, has become real. And that's it. The revolution is finished. The national aspirations of the Oromo people has been achieved, and so on. That was, for me, that was a mistake. That, yes, the Oromos want to demand sufficient share of power in the country, but primarily it is about self-rule at the local level and shared rule, substantive shared rule at the federal level, and then linguistic justice and so on and so forth. But it is not about only that. It's not about, it's not about ejecting one party or replacing one person with another, and then telling us, hooray, we have finished the business of struggle for power. The people are not empowered. For us, I was waiting for the real moment of transition to democracy, where people will exercise their agency, will through their votes, make or break their government. And that is when I say my people are empowered. And from the very start, when Abiy's regime started to be not a reformist, but rather a restorationist, as one of my colleagues says, because that was obvious in the very first speech he made in Parliament, where he said, we are going to return to the glory of our past and so on. What past glory do we have as a shared past, And from that moment on, I kept a critical eye on the regime. And it didn't take a month or so when everything started to militate against the Oromo Eros quest for social justice. And so I was holding out the critical eye on the regime, and I was insisting on the need for a proper transition. For example, when they talked about reconciliation commission, etc., they were talking in the language of transitional justice. And I was saying, how can you talk about transitional justice before transition? There wasn't transition yet. There wasn't a break from the past. You are still the EPRDF that was voted into office by 2015, in 2015, through a very flawed electoral process. And what is it that you are talking about as a new era dawning in the country? And if there is no newness in the power dynamics, then what transition are we talking about? We were saying transition is yet to come. And then suddenly Abiy came out and said, I am the transition. I am it. And I said, no, this can't be it. So that was when I stood out of the whole euphoria and celebratory thing. And I was watching him. Immediately, it turned against the whole Abiy's machine, turned against everything the Oromo protest stood for. It was against the self-rule demands, the linguistic justice, redistribution. It was against federalism. It was against self-determination. It was against the constitution that sanctioned these most important values. These values were important for the Qeerroo Oromo, not just because as part of the quest for social justice, but also because these have been the points of insistence on the part of the Oromo national struggle for ages. And I thought on my part, these values, self-determination, federalism, and the constitution are the potential redemptive, the infrastructure for redeeming that empire and reimagining Ethiopia. And the more Abiy's regime started to speak out against the federal system, the ethno-national, ethno-cultural justice that the constitution enshrines, the constitution itself, the principle of self-determination, which was couched in the language of divisive, this is what the TPLF divined to divide us and fragment the nation, and so on and so forth. When I saw that, I said, I think there is a need for a robust rejection of this. The hopes of the nations, the hopes of the other peoples of Ethiopia for a transformation at last, and for achieving a co-equal citizenship as the constitution proposes. The hopes of the nations to reclaim their collective agency through self-determination. The hopes of the nations to have a self-rule, autonomy at the regional level in a very democratic way. What was lacking was democracy in the federal setup for the past many years. And when now democracy is infused into it, then people would actually reclaim their agency and enjoy self-rule for real. Because in the absence of democracy, it could be only a decentralized despotism, It is a cadre of select cadres which are going to rule particular regions. The people are invisible. So this hope has been dashed, I thought. And there needs to be a regrouping to defend this. And so immediately the group that came under attack was the group that held on to the hope of federalism, self-determination, and constitutional popular sovereignty. And these groups are mainly in Oromia and in Tigray. According to Abiy, you have to crush these two places. And it is no accident. Immediately from both sides, you started to hear very vigorous defense of the federal system, the need for implementation of the constitution. In fact, the Oromo political parties, including the OFC, started to say, we want more of federalism, not less. And then in Tigray, of course, self-rule and autonomy. We don't want our party to be dissolved and united with the Prosperity Party and so on and so forth. They wanted to have a fair share in the federal government, but the members in the federation, in the House of Federation, were kicked out. The federal parliament were kicked out. The federal civil service were purged, and so on and so forth. So they realized that these two areas are the bastions of resistance against the regime's defederalizing project. And so naturally in Mekelle, there was this pro-federalist forces meeting. I think there was 2 rounds of meetings, and the OFC was coming up with statements after statements talking about more federalism. The Oromo political parties had a caucus where they spoke about some of the contents of the federal self-determination rights of the Oromo people. And then there was the Oromo Liberation Army, who was still not disarmed, refusing to disarm. And then an open war started. When Abiy couldn't defeat the insurrection, the insurgency in Oromia, then he said, wait, these have natural allies in Tigray. And the Tigray government is the obstacle against our intent to eliminate the OLA. So let's park this here and let's go to war in Tigray. So when they say that, now it is not about former EPRDF, former adversaries becoming my friends. It is that what I insist on happen to be what they insist on, and our interests converge, and naturally. And so when they were denied the right to democracy, the right to have elections, and when war broke out as a consequence, and they were under siege for a long time, even before that, economic siege really from Addis Ababa. And I, as a person who has been teaching minority rights for ages, I said, why is this happening? If there are issues that I have, legitimate issues, I would ask of the TPLF, then let's have a transition to democracy first, and then let's have an institutional setup of accountability upon which we all agree, and then I will ask for accountability. But now, before the transition, if you judge them as criminals wholesale, put them out, set them out as targets of attack. I didn't know how to keep quiet about this. So I started to speak out against those things, and people thought that I'm a fool, and I wasn't. And some people thought I'm doing it out of altruism. I wasn't. I was arguing for my own case, my own principles, and the interest of, in my view, the Oromo nation as well, and the Oromo protest movement, because the Oromo protest movement, the movement's unfinished business is there, and the transition didn't happen. All of the things that they sacrificed dearly for, they were completely thrown down the drain. And I said, I'm not trying to be a friend to Tigray or to the Sidama or to the Walaita or to some other nations that were affected by Abiy's regime immediately after his assumption to power. I was basically insisting on my right, and also the principle that maybe the constitutional federal framework is the entry point for a larger redemptive process, a larger constitutional redemptive process for the empire, and complete transformation of relations between state and society and among different members of society. And that was why I ended up defending what people would consider are the dominant force in the EPRDF. The EPRDF I fought against. I once again now trying to no, I wasn't defending EPRDF. It has its own share of criticism from me. It has had its own share of criticism from me. And I wasn't defending TPLF as an organization. I was defending principles, in particular, the right to self-determination, constitutional federalism, and popular sovereignty, and the aspiration for democracy. And none of these were achieved. And Abiy happened to be the enemy of all these things. And I was critical, almost alone, from even my own friends and colleagues, Oromos. And of course, when Tigray stepped out and said no to this, I said, that's it. That's the correct way to respond, to push back to Abiy. And there, I think our interests converged. And of course, what happened after that, as predicted, was an open genocidal madness, which was unfolding with a particular logic, a logic of elimination, which is very fascistic, to say the least. And in the face of fascism, you don't keep quiet. I'm sorry to say, I just couldn't. So it became my war. So I wasn't standing in solidarity with Tigray because I am a nice guy, but because their war was my war. Their wars and plights were the plights of all the nations in Ethiopia. And today, since 2021, we had established an organization called, a civic organization called Solidarity of Nations, which I preside over now. And one of the things that we do is we use self-determination, multinational federalism, popular sovereignty, constitutional way of managing relationships, including conflict, as a rallying point, as a common rallying point for all oppressed nations to come and form what I call is the coalition of the oppressed. And this, I think, is the reason why I continue to stand in solidarity with Tigray and Sidama and Wolaita and all the other nations such as Command, Ago, and so on and so forth. So, sorry, this is a very long-winded answer.
No, brilliant exposition of the philosophical underpinnings of the Constitution, of its provisions, and of its essence. And I would like us to dwell on the Constitution for a little while, actually. Not because I want us to get into the weeds of the Constitution. I think that wouldn't be right, not least because my positions wouldn't be as informed as yours. And I wouldn't want us to get our viewers bogged down in details. But I think discussion about the Constitution is important in one sense, in the sense that the Constitution now, and the way people see it, we have you, for instance, who's so venerated the Constitution, who has faith in the Constitution. And I'm sure that you don't believe the Constitution is perfect, but to the extent that you think that there needed to be change, you think that they should be brought about by incremental amendments and stuff like that. But on the other hand, and I think those would be people whom you would describe as your adversaries, there are people who believe that the Constitution is fundamentally a poisonous document that has set Ethiopia on a destructive path. And if anything, we should do away with the Constitution. So there are these two diametrically opposite views on the Constitution. And I think those diametrically opposed views are reflections of the conflicting views generally in the country. And the reason why there is always a palpable feeling that there's something wrong in Ethiopia, I think, is because of the way, or because of the various views that people have, and some of them are irreconcilable, I would say. And I want to ask you, Tsegaye, what you think are the various or the contrasting or the conflicting views in the country, and how the Constitution has tried to bridge some of them, and whether or not you think the Constitution is on a fundamental level an answer to those questions, or whether you think the people who are so derisive of the Constitution, the people who say that we have to start from a clean slate, have a point in terms of the Constitution.
Well, I think with regard to the Constitution and its amendment, etc., I think the Constitution is not a perfect document, and no Constitution is, and it deserves to be amended, not necessarily incrementally through evolutionary process, but also even on a radical level, but only the people can have to vote on it. That's all that it requires. But if we go for a revision or amendment within the constitutional frame itself, then you will have to have first a democratic institutional setup, meaning a democratically elected parliament, House of Federation, regional parliaments, and so on, because all of these are involved in the amendment process. But if you think that is fundamentally flawed and we need to have it revised, then whatever revision you want to make, it has to be submitted to the public. I can give them this much, okay? Let the people vote on it. Do not judge before the people voted on it, whether this document is divisive, poisonous, useless, etc. You know, I'm one of the persons who was critical about the legitimacy deficit of the Constitution. The Constitution, I claim, has an original deficit of legitimacy, meaning at the moment of the making, the way it was approved, the way it was drafted, deliberated upon, adopted, and ratified, did not have sufficient democratic air. Okay. To that extent, it lacked an original legitimacy. But then over time, through practice, there is a degree of legitimacy it has won from people. It's called derivative legitimacy. And that derivative legitimacy comes, in fact, mostly from the people who are least beneficiary of the Constitution, but who hold out the hope that whatever is in this Constitution will be helpful to promote our rights progressively. And least of all, I mean, the Oromo are at the forefront. The Oromo are the people who said we are most negatively affected by the EPRDF regime for 27 years. And that was that disaffection led to the Oromo protest movement and changed the regime. Okay. And yet, the Oromo are the group that has held on to the bare bones of the Constitution because of the undelivered promises, the hope of redemption within that Constitution. So I always said, there is in my article in 2010, The Making and Legitimacy of the Ethiopian Constitution, I said there was a fracture at the beginning, a lack of original legitimacy, okay, because of the flawed nature of the process. But there was a derivative legitimacy, which was incrementally coming on, mostly out of holding on to the hope of the promises. You know, the promises will be delivered someday. And because of this, the Constitution was kind of the dividing line in the political dynamics of Ethiopia, in the political map, if you like, of Ethiopia's, you know, the mainstream and the opposition. It was like one group says the Constitution is the cause of all our miseries, and therefore the Constitution must be totally put aside in order to see a better Ethiopia. And there is the mainstream during the PRDF and now the opposition, who say that the Constitution is the only way, at least instrumentally they used to say, the only way that can keep the country together, the only glue that can stitch us to each other and keep unity and keep the nation you know, as it is. Now, I was saying the Constitution isn't perfect. I am the first one to, in my book on issues of federalism, I drew an inventory of issues. You know, inventory of issues, meaning unresolved things that have to be looked into and changed. About 20, 25, I don't know, so many of them. Was a book written in 2008, so I don't even remember the details, but at least 20 amendments are necessary, I believe. Apart from the original lack of legitimacy it has, even as it stands now, we have to do some, institutional tinkering, processual tinkering, and so on and so forth in different places. But all that has to be done either through the constitutional process of amendment, or for which we need a democracy first, because we have to have a democratically ensconced set of institutions to engage in amendment. Otherwise, it's the power play, and it's not about real rules of the game set clearly, and we agree on the outcome at the end. And so you can do that through Articles 104 and 105 of the Constitution, or if because of the long overdue delay of infusing democracy into the system, if we are so frustrated that we need to have an abrupt kind of change of tones from within the Constitution, then let's do what I call a referendum on this. At the end of the day, what was lacking in 1991, 1995 was a referendum. It was ratified through representatives in the Constitutional Assembly, not through referendum. So, okay, there are groups who say we did not take part in it. Fine. Now let's have a referendum in which you also take part, and let's see the outcome. That was how far I can go. I believe in the imperfection. I believe that there are some original sins in the constitutions, and the original sin being the lack of original legitimacy. I believe that that can be perfected through either amendment, through various other mechanisms. I identify this in my other publications already. Now, that said, the Constitution is maligned unduly just out of sheer insistence on entitlement. There are groups that feel entitled to power, and not just entitled to power, but groups who think that some other people are wrongly entitled now. And this points straight into what Ethiopia is and whose state the Ethiopian state is, who belongs and who doesn't, who is the real citizen and who isn't. So what does that mean? That leads us to the conflicting visions, as my friend Awol says, the conflicting visions that are dominant in Ethiopia and that shape the political discourse to date, whether we know it or not. The conflicting visions are about the state, about the nature of the state, about the ownership of the state, about the role of diverse groups within that state, the stakes and interests of the diverse groups within that state, about the citizenship or the hierarchy in citizenship within that country, which also goes back to history, its imperial origin, the imperial origin of the state, and the uneven and ranked relationship among various groups. So one vision is the vision of the Ethiopian state, which looks at it as a multinational one. The other is as a nation state. Ethiopia is Ethiopia a multinational country or a mononational nation state? And we all know that it is not a nation state. And 1969, Wallerling has clearly stated that it is not a nation state. There are many nations. There are Walaita nation, Somali nation, etc., within this mosaic. And so the question that leads to the conflicting visions is that the question of whether Ethiopia is a multinational country because it was a multinational empire or a nation state. And of course, during imperial times, there was an attempt to create one nation out of many and creating Ethiopia into a nation state like most European states. And when Haile Selassie talks about modernization and civilization and progress and so on and so forth, he was basically saying, when he wrote the constitution in 1931, he was basically saying, let's be like one of the European nation states. And nation state is also the language of colonial imperial international law, remember, and liberal internationalism since 1918. So They were, of course, aspiring to create a nation state. That was disrupted by the Ethiopian student movement in 1969. Between 1960 and 1969, the discourse was, there was a lot of tussle among the first group of intelligentsia in Ethiopia, but in 1969, explosively, Walelin's paper made it clear that this is a multinational empire and that has got lots of deficit. And we thought that was a settled issue. That was a resolved issue. We thought that there was a national question, the language of the left at the time. So the students were trying to find a language and they found the Stalinist-Leninist language, but it could have as well been Wilsonian democracy with which to couch this issue. So it was a national question. And the Derg had no problem with the national question. They said there is a class question, there is a national question. Class question through land to the tiller, it will be dealt with through the land to the tiller proclamation. The national question through autonomy and right to self-determination and equality of languages and cultures, but we need to keep the territorial integrity and national unity of the country and so on and so forth. We thought it is settled. And then when the EPRDF came, they said the national question was subordinated to the class question. And however emancipated we were in class terms, still the cultural hegemony stands there against the interest of the many, the multitude in Ethiopia, as opposed to the one group. So they infused a second revolution, during which time the subordinated national question was now to come front and center, to come to the front and the center. We thought this is settled in 1991. But no, from that time on, those who were disgruntled because of the loss of power, the Ethio-Amhara elite, as I call them, or generally the Ethiopianist elite, wanted to take it out on the constitution. Why? Because they subscribed to that failed project of building one nation out of many. And today they mentioned the American melting pot model, calling the motto of the American Republic, E pluribus unum, out of many one. But the Ethiopian model is not like that. The constitution says in one many, okay? In one many, plures in uno, not E pluribus unum. And so the conflicting vision can be captured with these two strange Latin phrases, out of many one, or one in many. Do we keep one in many? And a very interesting book written immediately after the adoption of the constitution was one by Fasil Nahum, one of the architects of the constitution itself. He wrote a book saying a constitution for a nation of nations. Ethiopia, a constitution for a nation of nations. So we thought it was settled. That was a 1997 book, mind you. And it already talked about a nation of nations. That's what we are. And yet today it has another resonance because those who lost power in 1991 had not, there is this unrequited love of the nation state, Ethiopia as a nation state. And that project has collapsed, and they didn't accept that one. And they want to resuscitate that project of one nation, building one nation out of many. And Ethiopia is a nation state, and the divisions, even today, they say we have been intermarried and there is a lot of cultural intercourse. Why are you talking about differences instead of unity? We are being unified as a nation, etc. But yes, we have been personally intermarried. I am one example of those people who are intermarried. Okay, I'm myself a child of two groups, and so on and so forth. But that didn't resolve the national question. Groups as groups haven't achieved collective agency, haven't determined their destiny, and the unjust relationship that started with the building of the empire, the conquest, the land alienation, the dispossession and displacement, the denigration and the othering of all the other peoples. Those issues haven't been addressed. The fact that some elite folks are intermarried, or some elite Oromos or southern peoples are conscripted into the modern Ethiopian state by way of cooptation or because of their privilege as beneficiaries of modern education. That hasn't resolved the thing, and Ethiopia hasn't evolved into a nation state. And that's not, intermarriage is not the way to build a nation state anyway, out of many nations that are brought together through imperial conquest. And so they haven't really abandoned that dream of creating one nation out of many. And they still see Ethiopia as a nation state. And the large majority of Ethiopians see Ethiopia as a multinational country, as a multinational state. The thing that flows from this statement, the multinational nature of the country, is the fact that all the nations are entitled to the state. They own the state. And this is clear in the constitution, which says we, the diverse groups, and by nations and nationalities and peoples, by the way, it is a code word for the other peoples. In Ethiopia's political parlance, it doesn't refer to the Amhara. Nations and nationalities and peoples is somebody else all the time. Okay, which means when they read the constitution and read the nations and nationalities clause, they see the non-Amhara. And that's why they don't see themselves in there. But actually, we believe if Ethiopia is a multinational country, Amhara is one among many, and it has equal entitlement to the state. And so if you read the constitution, we, the nations and nationalities and peoples, wanting to build a common one economic and political community, using our right to self-determination, exercising our right to self-determination, have established this constitution and so on and so forth. And they have an equal entitlement with others. The only difference now is that all the formerly oppressed nations, the other peoples, are now co-equally owners of the Ethiopian state. That is resented, number one. So multi-foundational nature of the republic is contested. And because historically, the Ethiopian state, Abyssinia, has its own myth about being the owner of the state, the founder of the state. Ethiopia now, according to the constitution, is multi-foundational. Ethiopia, before Abyssinia, at least, is a bi-foundational state, much like Canada was a bi-foundational state, like the Quebecois and the Anglophone and Francophone, which was again contested by the indigenous peoples, and now they talk about bi-foundationalism. So Ethiopia is a multi-foundational country. And the Ethio-Amhara elite, which deride the constitution, deride it precisely because of the multi-foundational nature. And that denies the privilege of the Amhara elite as the owner of the state, the founder of the state. And you see it in the statements of the Amhara national movement, Nama, Abin in Amharic. They always say we are the lion's share in building this country. The Amhara are the real owners of the country. Where this city is ours, this territory is ours. All those things come from the fact that they see the nation as a nation state, they see the country as a nation state, and they see that they are entitled to the state distinctly, as distinguished, contradistinguished from the others, and they do not want to be one among many owners of the state. So, because of the conflicting visions, we have unresolved issues. Is Ethiopia a multinational country or a nation state? Is it a multi-foundational country or a uni-foundational state? Is it a multicultural, multilingual state or a unilingual, a monolingual state? For example, Amharic should be the only privileged working language of the federal government. It is an inheritance of the imperial times, but there is no particular reason, there is no just reason put forward in defense of the Amharic language, except it is a common working language. I mean, many people speak that language. Many people don't, actually. A large majority of Ethiopians do not speak it. The federal government has to use that language, but there was a demand for pluralizing the federal government's working languages. And they insist that it has to be unilingual because they consider it as a nation state. They insist that all other languages have to write in the Sabian script, in the Amharic script. And the reason is because that's the country of that language. And they say this is unique the Ethiopian exception in Africa, and so on and so forth. You see, this is where the difference is, and some of it might not be resolved unless you use a politics of politeness, modesty, you know? You have to be modest, and for the sake of mutual recognition and mutual coexistence requires that you have to be modest. It's not only, and also it is because of this conflicting vision that we have today what we call the Amhara anxiety. The Amhara anxiety is much like the white anxiety, that what has been Ethiopia is going to collapse. We are going to lose. There is a fear of loss and nostalgia for the past. And I always say, why do you have to bear that responsibility of worrying about Ethiopia alone? It's not your, only your country. It's our country. We have to share the burden, share the responsibility. Of course, historically, we have shared the disproportionate burden. As oppressed people, we have fought all the wars, contributed to the economy larger than the others, especially I can speak for the Oromo, for example. And yet, we are not even entitled to be in that country today, as you see in the discourse of the most Amhara right-wing elite and even Ethio-Amhara elite, like the Izema and so on and so forth. So I say this Amhara anxiety has come from the vision that Ethiopia is a nation state, whose cultural DNA is Amharic, okay? And anything that spoils this is a threat to national security. And the notion of treason has changed its definition now in Ethiopia. If you want to keep that cultural DNA of Ethiopia, you can do treason by conscripting external armies, including Eritrea and other countries, and march on your people. It's not a problem. That was a classic case of treason, actually. So they have completely lost sight of exactly what political language is appropriate for that country's governance. So the underlying problem is the fact that this started out as a colonial empire, to be honest. And now people hesitate to say colonial, but the Ethiopian texts are not ashamed of it. Yeqiny agar, the colonies, they used to say, Oromia, for example, is Yeqiny agar. It was a colony. And the problem is that it is an empire, and empire is having an afterlife. And one of the things that Abiy did immediately after assuming power is to resuscitate the imperial nostalgia and making it into a state ideology. It became a state ideology, yearning for the old glory, making Ethiopia great again. Literally, this is the words that Abiy used. And calling all the imperial skeletons from whatever closet they have been hiding in, and bringing them back into the political square, the public square. And result is a collision course. The result is that it started out to invite the old hierarchical relationship, the ranked relationship among Ethiopians. It rejected the equal citizenship model that is inscribed in the constitution. His politics basically is the more divisive one than the constitution. It leads to misrecognition of nations and a huge barrage of media insults, denigration, dehumanization of different groups. And misrecognition is one of the early steps towards genocide. And renaming in the old ways. If you hear about how the most Amhara statements come out when they talk about Oromos, for example, it's they bring in old pejorative names which were outlawed in 1974, and that's what's happening. So in a way, they are now relitigating the national question. That's the underlying problem, relitigating the national question. Many people are now writing articles and doing conferences about whether Walilin was Wallerling was a revolutionary or a culturally dislocated person. There is a whole book written by Masai Kabeda, the logic of cultural dislocation about Ethiopia. How the 1960s student movement was basically a result of cultural alienation, cultural imperialism, and relitigating the national question means trying to set the political clock, to turn the political clock back, and the historical clock back, and that is what is leaving us on collision course. Now, in more concrete political terms, the underlying problems is that there are unfinished struggles. The unfinished struggle for self-determination. The resolution of the national question in concrete terms. To a certain extent, constitutionally, it is resolved, but concretely it isn't because of lack of democracy. And that's why the key now is to dare to transition to democracy. And that's precisely what Abiy foreclosed when in 2020, he postponed the election, and then he had a sham election, and with a party that wasn't even registered at the time, and the Prosperity Party. So there is this unfinished struggle for self-determination, unfinished struggle for implementing a multinational federal dispensation, unfinished struggle for ethnocultural justice, for example, linguistic justice, linguistic parity, and generally the unfinished struggle for achieving the undelivered promises of the FDRE constitution. And on the other side, of course, there is the restorationist claim, which seeks to restore the old, imperial times vision of Ethiopian state. And along with that, of course, restoration of land, territory. There's this renewed interest to claim territory from all sides, from Oromia, from Amhara, from Tigray, from Benishangul Gumuz, from Afar, and so on and so forth. And I think those are the problems. And generally, academics have long been portraying this as the problem of competing nationalisms. Marara Gudina is one example, for example, whose thesis is about competing nationalisms. And these competing nationalisms create conflicts of different types, conflicts of self-determination. And these put forward incongruent demands. Conflicts of self-determination in itself comes in many forms. One is in recognition of identity and fighting against misrecognition, looking for a distinct identity, meaning disassociation. It is also a right, I am a Silte, not a Gurage. I am a Kmant, not an Amhara. I am an Agau, not an Amhara. And so on and so forth. So that's fundamental misrecognition. I mean, the right to the struggle for a distinct identity. Then there is the right to survival, existence, protection from extermination, extinction, because there is the threat of genocide all the time. And then there is the right, the struggle for languages, either parity of languages or even recognition as a distinct language. And then there is the struggle for local self-rule. You can mention myriads of cases, like in terms of, for example, distinct identity, you can name Yem, Amant, Agau, Gofa, etc. Or Denta, Donga, Budem. I mean, these are names that people are not even aware of, but these are cases filed in the House of Federation for recognition as a distinct group for many years and have been suppressed. You have quest for local governance, separate spatial warada, spatial zone, spatial district, and so on and so forth. You have struggle for self-determination in the sense of statehood. You know, about 12 groups in the southern nations alone were looking for statehood, Hadia, Kambata, Gurage, and so on and so forth. What we see now, but during Abiy's time, is the suppression of those struggles and the arbitrary creation of new states like the southwestern region. And the Walaita, etc., have been bitten hard because of their demand for statehood. And then the big question of separation, cessation, remedial cessation on the part of Tigray, for example, and separatist impulses in Somali region, and the demand for self-determination of the Oromo people. The Oromo want to have a say on whether they are in or out of Ethiopia, you know, and particularly more so today because of the many abuses that they have been subjected to, and the complete loss of hope that the future will bring about more democracy and inclusion and participation in the government. And then, of course, there are the issues of disputes over land, interpersonal as well as, you know, collective. And these are the underlying problems that can be processed in terms of political language, concrete political language that we see today. Now, the struggles I mentioned have been couched through various languages. In the 1960s, they were couched in the language of the national question. The leftist paradigm was there, in the language of self-determination and decolonization, because it was a time of decolonization of Africa and so on. In more recent years, it was couched in the language of group rights, minority rights, in the language of human rights in general, the International Bill of Rights, in the language of liberal multiculturalism, accommodation, recognition of indigenous peoples, recognition of migrants and other peoples in general. And so those are the underlying issues that are behind animating the conflicting vision. So it is how Abiy plays on these visions to supplant them or to suppress them, because he has got his own kind of vision with which he wants to supplant these conflicting visions or resolving these conflicting visions. And these are the things that he is playing upon, and these are the things that are now have led us to the war that we are still in the midst of.
Well, I think you have raised many fundamental points that I would ideally have wanted us to further explore, but I think we're fast running out of time, and I know that we are very, very time scheduled. But one thing that I would press you on, Tsegaye, is the issue of the national question. I think that's a very important one, and actually the entire sort of gamut of views in Ethiopia, political views, and the various political positions about the panoply of political parties in Ethiopia take revolve around their perception of that issue of the national question. And you also raised the issue of whether or not Ethiopia was a nation state. And some of your public interlocutors, like Lidoto, with whom we had a bit of a run-in a couple of months ago, we generally don't mention people on this channel, but I think he's a public intellectual, so it's fair enough. People like him would say that you are essentially a lefty, and you are someone who has been influenced by revolutionary thinking, by Marxist thinking, but that otherwise Ethiopia, with all its problems, yes, it might have various people with various languages, ethnic backgrounds, and historical backgrounds, but essentially it's a nation state. And you would seem to gravitate towards the view that actually Ethiopia is not a nation state. So what I would like to ask you, because I think this is a very fundamental matter, is can you establish I understand politics is a game of opinions, but can you establish in something approximating categorical terms that Ethiopia actually is not a nation state, and that people should come to terms with that fact and try to find a common ground, taking that into account?
Yes, Ethiopia is not a nation state. It was an aspiration, an unfulfilled aspiration during the imperial times. The emperor has tried to create a nation state out of all the many nations, mostly by denial, by saying that there are groups, tribes, clans, but we are generally one people. And they project this idea of nation state because that's also the language of liberal international law at the time. For Ethiopia to be recognized in the international system, in the international community, to be a member of the League of Nations, it has to project this one nation state idea, which is in fact Christian, just like Europe was, because they wanted to be part of the gentleman's club in Europe. Post-Westphalian Europe was basically a Europe of nations, a Europe of nation states. And it was into that international community that Haile Selassie wanted to inject himself as a member. And in order to go in there, they had to say, we are a nation state. And there are no significant diversities. We are a united people. We have got one civilized religion, which is Christianity. All the others are minorities, and so on and so forth. And of course, along with that also was the idea of one, universal, certain, clear set of laws, Christian laws and Deftanagist and the Ethiopian constitution. There wasn't any, there was the issue of slave trade. So you see, in a way, Ethiopia projects this uncolonized vision, image of itself. But in fact, it's not just that there is an internal colonization going on side by side, but Ethiopia actually beat European colonization by using its own terms, by saying, look, I am like you. I am white, not quite black. I am Christian, not quite uncivilized. I am civilized, we are the land of Prester John of India. We are the land of the Bible. We are the second Zion. We are the symbol of Black independence. We are in Africa, but not quite of Africa. We are the same. And we want to be guests in the scramble for Africa after all, and so on and so forth. So Ethiopia resisted colonialism by mimicry, by mimicking colonial powers. So in the sense that they bought into the terms of European colonialism to resist it, they are already colonized. So the Ethiopian exceptionalism is actually an attempt to be more like Europe so that it can be considered as a civilized European nation to be part of the international community. That panoply of ideas which they came up with in order to make themselves intelligible in the eyes of the international community of the time, actually made them want to project a nation state identity. Ethiopia is not. Obviously, it is not. 5 kilometers away, you drive 5 kilometers away from the capital city, you encounter other nations, encounter other peoples, Oromos, then the Sidama, then the Kambata, the Hadiya, the Donga, all sorts of peoples, just within 140 kilometers of the distance from the capital city, which basically says that this is a multinational empire. And the people in the past, the leaders of the past, did not deny this. The Derg did not deny this. The Derg says, yes, we are a multinational country, true. We don't say there are nations. There is one nation, but there are 7 nations, okay, nationalities. But we will not negotiate on the territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Why? The reason comes from elsewhere, not from justness of the situation, but rather because our national unity and independence is a hard-earned one. Blood was spilled over this to defend the national unity and territorial integrity of this country. And we, being soldiers, defenders of the sovereignty, cannot compromise on that. Yes, there are diversities. We recognize autonomy, but that's the end of the story. But today, the inheritors of the Derg and the imperial system do not even recognize as much. They want to say, this is a nation state, we are intermarried, we are intermixed, and we are one cultural community, and so we are a finished product, we are a nation state. So who undid the fact that we are a nation state? The TPLF, PRDF. How did they do so? Through this ethnic federal system. And I don't think the word ethnic federal ethnic federation is an apt and appropriate term. But so they were trying to undo the recognition of multinationality or plurinationality that is in the constitution. But all the facts around the country tell you that it is a multinational country. And because it is a multinational country, it doesn't mean it has to be deconstructed and done away with. No. Precisely because it is a multinational country, it has to deal with its unjust foundation. The way to deal with that unjust foundation, the violence that constituted it, we need to undo it through the right to self-determination, through a clear recognition of the many-ness of the Ethiopian identity. And that's all I was saying in terms of when I talk about redemption. I'm not saying we have to do away with this empire and create a state of many types around the Horn of Africa. In fact, one of the reasons I run the Solidarity of Nations is because we have to create solidarity among the different nations, even after asserting their collective agency through right to self-determination, because this is an ecologically fragile, geopolitically volatile area. We cannot survive alone unless we cooperate. And in fact, the very fact that we have a federal system is a reaction to the two fears that underlie any federation, two fears. And these, hello? Are you there? Yes. So there are two major fears that always animate all federations. First and foremost, fear of insecurity. Fear of insecurity, if you stay alone geopolitically, makes you want to unite with other people. And second, fear of economic inviability. And my hope is through multinational federal system, we will build the largest democracy in the Horn of Africa, because it's also an open federal system, by the way. You have the right to secession, but you have the right to reunite as well. And Article 39, much hated as it is the case of the dividing that actually unites. It's very inviting for many weaker, smaller populations to join a bigger security framework and a bigger economic market. And when I was young, I was always saying through the multinational federal structure, we're going to be able to build the largest democracy in the Horn of Africa and the largest economic market in the Horn of Africa. If we allow the openness of the federal nature to not only assert one's own collective agency and separate, but also invite others to come in. If the federal system really works out well, by the way, I always say, even those people who have imperial nostalgia and who think that Ethiopia from Ras Kaisar, from Eritrea down to Moyale are one, they can win back Eritrea through democratic, legitimate mechanisms. They can win back Djibouti, which was Ethiopian until 1979. They can win back Somaliland, which is hankering for, yearning for recognition internationally, which is still an unrecognized country 20 years after its unilateral declaration of independence. You have all sorts of things. I think I wrote a very ambitious article in 2009. It's about exporting Ethiopia's federal system, that kind of thing. Extra
ambitious
relevance
indeed.
for, and part of the thing I imagine is through this multinational federal setup, Ethiopia's true redemption comes. The empire now becomes a very democratic republic of weak people groups that together can be very strong. In an ecologically fragile area, geopolitically volatile area, we can have a great solidarity. And that's what animates my work in the Solidarity of Nations. And I always say, self-determination is not only a way of ushering in democracy, but also asserting collective agency and enjoying some degree of ethnocultural justice as a distinct group, but also to unite with other people. Once you have self-determination, you consciously, consensually unite with other people, create a more viable union, and because there is no fear. If you are disaffected by some cause at some point, you always know that you can table a referendum and you can always step out. And this is the guarantee for peace. This is the guarantee for a broad democracy. This is a guarantee for equality, inclusion, and building a more just and fair society in the Horn of Africa. And most people who think that this is not a nation state, this is a multinational state, because I want to destroy Ethiopia. There is no point, there is nothing to enjoy about destruction. If it were, if there was anything to be enjoyed out of destruction, Abiy would have been the happiest guy today, because he has really destroyed a whole country, a whole region. And there is nothing amiable, there is nothing enjoyable about it. Even when you destroy your enemy, it's an unsightly sight, to be honest. And I don't think people understood the enormous potential of national federalism that is rooted in the principle of self-determination of groups. And for me, it is very much redemptive. For most people, however, is a threat. And I don't think there is a way out. That's the way out, to consider that it is a threat. And most of the times they actually relish on fear-mongering. And they say, if so-and-so has asserted its threat, then we will be destroyed. I mean, the country will be undone, and so on. That is a politics of fear-mongering. That is not a politics of hope. And in my view, the multinational federal kind of solidarity is a reason for a hope, a reason for a lasting peace, a reason to create a more just relationship among nations, among groups, among individuals in the Horn of Africa. And I don't think that is very much understood. And still, that's because historically nationalists are said to be, parochial, ababuch, and all those things. And some of them actually have the temerity to say, this is apartheid. They say these are fascists and so on. No, we are all nationalists. Ethiopian nationalists are no less nationalists than other, the Oromo or the Tsegaye nationalists. And the question is, which is a just nationalism, and in my view, the multinationalism basically recognizes all nationalisms in the country and accommodates them and gives them a leeway when they are disaffected to be with us. But, we can understand each other, and we will have a sure way of resolving our conflicts, self-determination, when we just can't feel like we can't live with each other. And that's all I was arguing for the last 20 years. But of course, for the sake of, silencing you, people say all sorts of things as a cessationist, separatist, terrorist, and someone who hates Ethiopia so much and so on. No, in fact, my criticism has always been an act of loyalty and an act of honoring the blood spilled from my family. My father, my grandfather died defending this country. My many brothers actually have been in the military, and I owe no less than critical loyalty
to that country?
Well, we said Article 39 is the divider that united the country. Such counterintuitive, but otherwise pithy observation. And of course, other people, the people on the right, the people whom he said have been grouped by politics of nostalgia for the past and the paranoia, I would say that Article 39 is something that a noose that the TPLF and OLF put around Ethiopia's neck, and that they're waiting to pull it when the time is convenient. And of course, I know that you have challenged people like Lidoto to debate you either in Afan Oromo or in English, I believe. So maybe not sure about Afan Oromo, but I could organize a debate in English. So Lidoto, if you're listening to us, you know what to do. So again, this has been such a wonderful conversation, but I'll give you one more opportunity for you to give us your concluding remarks. And also to close the circle that you drew at the beginning. You said that part of your motivation and drive comes from the knowledge that there is some unfinished business. And I think part of the unfinished business is finding a lasting compromise and playing a role in bringing about that lasting compromise in Ethiopia. And I know it's very difficult to predict, but what do you see at the compromise or at the middle ground? Maybe it would be a better term for Ethiopia.
Well, the middle ground, I think, starts with recognition of the fact that we are a multinational country. That's the starting point. Anything less is a non-starter in that country. You have to recognize that we are a multinational country. And then, of course, we are at a post-conflict time, can we say, about at least Tigray. And we are at a time when there is a huge devastation and loss that has not yet been mourned. And there is a lot of work that awaits in the form of reconstruction and restoration, reconstruction of the economy and restoration of lives, which requires restitution, recompense and resettlement and all those things. But the way out for me, the common ground is first mutual recognition. This has been an exhausted language, of course, mutual recognition, but at least recognition of the multinational nature of the country. And there are groups that try to weaponize Ethiopia and Ethiopian identity and the survival of Ethiopia against others, against the other peoples of Ethiopia. I think the Ethio-Amhara elite will do well to not weaponize Ethiopian identity. Ethiopia belongs to all of us, and nobody is more responsible for preserving Ethiopia than others. I mean, we all have equal stake in that country, and they have to abandon this unnecessary burden, unnecessary anxiety, which I have referred to as Amhara anxiety. And they should just ease the burden off their shoulders and share the burden with others. And that starts with the recognition of multinational nature of the country. And secondly, it's high time for them to recognize popular sovereignty, to recognize the fact that popular sovereignty means nothing but what the people say is binding. That's all it means. Vox populi, vox Dei. What the voice of the people is the voice of God. It's a final voice. Now, in principle, the right to self-determination is exactly that. And the right to self-determination is unpalatable to most of my adversaries, the Ethio-Amhara elite. However, if that is unpalatable because of its long political use and exhaustion in the realm, I think they would do well to consider the principle of popular sovereignty. Trust the people. If you have some issues that you would like to be decided in your favor, then campaign for it and make it open for a vote by the people. And let's not underestimate people. If you truly, in the 21st century, if you believe that democracy is the only way to resolve differences, then you have to believe in the people's wisdom, the people's ability to make a choice, and a choice that is good for them. and let us not be so much of elitist who would like to have the opinion and execute that opinion without even sharing it with the people, but in the name and on behalf of the people. So the common ground is recognize that there are other people in this country, that there is equal responsibility upon all of us to care for and to work for the well-being of the country. And thirdly, there are unjust grievances that you don't necessarily agree with, but at least have the tolerance to listen to some inconvenient truths. And this leads us to what's called ethical listening. Don't even listen, but just bear with them as they come up with their narrative, their experience of pain, when they mourn their loss. Recognize those and celebrate your heroes, all right, but don't dance on their turf, to celebrate your heroes, which might not be shared heroes. And if you do that modest act of ethical listening, I think that's the third middle ground. And fourthly, recognize the fact that there has to be some language with which we can manage our differences. You can't just your opinion against me, and your opinion and against me prevails, not even because of the strength of the force of argument I make, but rather because of the number of Kalashnikovs I hold. If that is the way to do it, I don't think there will be any common ground in that regard. So what I suggest and hope my compatriots would take seriously is we need to have some language. And for now, I believe the language with which we can manage our differences is the Constitution. So let's go back to the constitutional signposts, as I say. Okay, I grant that you don't agree with most of the provisions there. I grant that you have no belief that it is a legitimate document, fine, but we have to manage our discourse now. And the only way we can manage our discourse is through some language, and that language is in the Constitution. Let's return to the constitutional signposts. For now, I think in more concrete terms, the prescription one has to make is that the country is militarized and it has to be demilitarized. War has to stop. And we are suffering tons of humanitarian crises, and humanitarian reconstruction has to begin. And thirdly, for example, in Tigray, we talk about a lot about post-conflict justice, transitional justice, and so on and so forth. But first and foremost, occupied territories must be vacated. I mean, those has to be given back to the people. But okay, we have disagreements about whose territory they are, but there is time for that, and there is a constitutional process for that. Meantime, we need to make sure that perpetrators of mass atrocities are held accountable. At least we want to see some measures towards getting arrest warrants for at least people who have manifestly, demonstrably committed, and we all agree upon as committing different kinds of crimes. And then, of course, try to put in place an investigative mechanism, which is internationally recognized and monitored. Once those are done, there is a genuine attempt towards accountability and justice, and a commitment to look back at the constitutional sign, to track back to the constitutional signposts. I think we can come to some middle ground from where to start a more sane constitutional and political conversation. But at the moment, conversations are broken, and social media is not helping it. Confrontations are the norm of the day. Irresponsible confrontations and antagonisms I think we need to somehow find the temperament and the language with which to communicate with each other around the constitutional signposts and around the basic grievances that we have. As for the Oromo, I think we are still at war, and there is a renewed military operation in Wallagga. And just a few days ago, Abiy went to Naqamte and he actually threatened the people with another operation, military offensive, headed by General Getachew Guddina. And probably this coming week, it will be a very massive onslaught on the people of Oromia. And there is this attempt at undoing the regional structure, changing the Oromia region, I mean, dividing the Oromia region into five regions, and there shall be no Oromia as we know it so far. And that is only creating more fuel. I mean, adding more fuel to the existing conflict. And Abiy virtually either has to be stopped or has to stop for his own sake, for the country's sake, and at least bring everything to a halt for the moment. Any constitutional redesigning things have to be brought to a halt, and societies must be demilitarized, and as they have been trying to do to disarm the special forces in the regions recently. But there was also a very prevalent social militarization, particularly in the Amhara region. I think that has to be addressed as well. Calm and basic peace and stability has to be reestablished before we even begin to engage in sane conversations. Social media and the diaspora conversation is very toxic. Everybody seems to have their own media outlets nowadays. Whoever has a telephone, a mobile phone has a media. And there we are finding only confrontations and antagonisms. And it is not a way of working through all those difficult issues regarding the conflicting visions. Instead, we are basically denying the other's voice, suppressing the other's voice, and trying to shout louder, proclaiming our own slogans, and that is not helping. But I hope in the country, in Ethiopia, there is a possibility for a more sane conversation if we hold first all the aggressions, all the wars, all the militarizations, and silence the guns first, and then sit down and commit oneself to a peaceful negotiation, and commit oneself to return to some kind of rule of the game, which is, for me, the constitutional signposts. But even if that is not palatable, some other kinds of negotiation. Now, I have many specific recommendations about what has to be. For me, Abiy and his regime are fascistic regimes, and they have to be only defeated. And in order to defeat them, we need to have a solidarity among the different nations and coalition against them, because fascists are always beaten by a coalition of forces. But if that's not possible at this point in time, because Abiy kind of co-opts at least some Oromos as allies, as his constituency, if that is not possible, at least it's important for him to hold all the military operations and begin to accommodate other voices and negotiate with OLA, for example, and then see where that negotiation will take us. As complex and complicated and many our problems are, the solutions are not far out of reach. The solutions are very easy, really. Basic decency, to listen to each other, to solve our problems amicably, and to find ways of recognizing your grievance and holding on to mine. That would be, I think, enough for us to take a positive step towards a solution. It is not an impossible task. And I always think, I don't know why, I always think that there is a solution within reach, but I think the discourse is not one that is amenable to that. Sorry, I took.
Yeah. I think you have healthy. Yeah, I think you have a healthy degree of for optimism, and I think it's good that people have that. I mean, you mentioned some ominous things in terms of what Abiy might be getting up to with Oromia, some military developments, and also attempt to dismember Oromia. These are really dangerous things that I know Abiy might attempt, because as we have come to know, Abiy is a man with a hammer who thinks that everything is a nail, and his hammer is war, and nail is all the political problems. And I think I can only hope that cooler heads within Oromia and Ethiopia prevail, and at the very least find a way to restrain him. But thank you for this wonderful conversation, Tsegaye. It was a really deeply educational conversation for me, and I'm sure my viewers are going to be enjoy and learn from this conversation as well. Many people would be unhappy that we haven't discussed the Tigray war, because it's a serious, horrific war that's happening, and also the things, the political dynamic in Oromia and other current events. But I think it's partly because of shortage of time, but also it's by design in some sense, because I want people to spend as much time trying to understand the underlying problems, because at the end of the day, the war and all the devastation that we witness on a daily basis that has gripped people's imagination is a manifestation of these deeply problems that have been unexamined to my liking. And so this conversation is an attempt to try to understand what Ethiopia is as a country, and what are the various views, and why is it that some views seem irreconcilable. And so I am appealing to our viewers to understand why we stayed clear of the daily events. Thank you again. Again, I'm so grateful for this conversation.
So it's been a pleasure. I hope we'll have another episode to flesh out some of the topics that we touched upon today. And thank you for your patience and for the generosity with your time.
Thank you. Have been Tsegaye. Goodbye.